So, Rob, it's great to see you today.
Thank you.
Can't wait to hear a little more about your book and what's going on with you now.
So, at the end of the story, where my wife and I have been married faithfully for 44 years, we have two adult children. Our daughter, Alicia, has four biological children 12, 9, 6, and 3, plus a foster baby who's 1.5 years old. And she homeschools. Our son is a pastor at a good sized church in Raleigh on target. He's the associate on target to be the senior pastor in 4 years. And he and his wife have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. My wife retired from being a ordained minister, and she thrives on being a grandmother to these uh, 7 grandchildren. I'm still very active in my business. My team, we advise to about $400 million in the stock market. So that's our story today.
Yes, quite a success story. I mean, from the beginning and then to this much fulfillment in your family and in your success in your business. Um, when we go back and talk a little bit about the book and what started the process of writing the book.
So I didn't want to write the book, and I really didn't. I fought God very hard. And I remember it was August of 94. And when I finish my prayer time, I always stop to see if God has something to say to me. And God doesn't speak to me often, but when He does, it's usually a word or phrase that I know is not my own. And I'd just finished praying, saying, "You can't make me write this book. I'm not going to do it." And stopped to listen, and God said one word: begin. And I knew it was God because I didn't want to do this. Now, most books are written on a proposal. Here's my idea. Publisher gives them a third down. You write the book, turn it in, they give you another third. Book gets published, you get another third. But I knew this was going to be harder than that because I wanted to take the reader into the world of what I call kids like us, into our confusion, into our anger, into our rage, into our hopelessness, and focus on the family. And Tyndale published my book, and they said, "Look, you got to be realistic. You're only going to sell 6,000 to 7,000 copies in lifetime." I said, "You don't understand. You might think this is about a boy in an orphanage, but it's not. That's just the detail. This book is about being abandoned, being betrayed, being unloved, unwanted, not knowing your place in the world, being angry at one or both of your biological parents, and being angry with God. That's what this book is about." And today, I'm grateful that it's been published in 7 languages. And in every culture that I've spoken in, whether it's Europe, many parts of South America, all over America. And in 2019, the Chinese government invited me to be one of only 2 foreigners to speak at their first national convention on at-risk kids. And even in China, the same issues, even through translators. Same color, different colors of skin, different cultures, same issues. Um,
That's amazing. And I want to touch on something you said, the anger and the rage and the commonality of that with you and the kids that you were growing up with in similar situation, maybe not exactly the same. Um, and then now looking at you today, I mean, what is the difference in you?
so I think I want to go back to the beginning, if you allow me. How did my life start that way? When I was 3 years old, my father abandoned my mother and I, put a bullet to his head, pulled the trigger, and blew out part of his brains. But he did not kill himself. And a man with a college degree, a master's degree from prestigious Northwestern University, spent the next 26 years of his life in a mental hospital in Georgia. He could walk, but he could not talk. He could put food in his mouth, but because of the bullet damage, not always chew and swallow. He wore diapers. He could put his pants on, but not remember where or when to go to the bathroom. So for 26 years, he wore diapers till the day he died. My mother had tremendous emotional and psychological problems that she had hid from him before they married, but when you marry, those kind of things come out. And 3-year-olds aren't supposed to remember much or anything, but kids like us, who have crisis moments, we either block it out, never remember, or we never forget. And I won't forget that day. She drugged me from Chicago to Little Princeton, Illinois, where the orphanage was. And she's dragging me in January, and there's snow on the ground. It's about 5 blocks, and I'm whimpering, and she's yelling at me, "Shut up, Robbie, shut up." She takes me to this big building, 3-story building, takes me to the second floor, commands me to play at blocks with a strange boy. And I reach for a block and he steals it. And I reach for a block and he steals it. And I turn to my mother for help and she's gone. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't say I love you. She didn't say I'll come back in a little bit. She's just gone. And the strange woman in a strange place that my mother's abandoned me says, your mother's sick, Robbie. She's taking the train back to Chicago. She'll come get you when she's well. And I remember rising up the floor and 3-year-old clumsiness screaming, no, no, and running to the nearest door, but I don't know where it goes and I can't reach the handle anyway. This woman says, quit crying, Robbie, or I'll spank you. I can't quit crying. My mother's abandoned me. And she picks me up and spanks me over and over again until the pain of being spanked is worse than the pain of being abandoned. And then my memories go back.
That childlike fear and just completely, of the unknown, right? And then the sadness and loneliness and really just fear. Because at that time, you're not really sure of what abandonment is, right? But when you did have the chance to see her again and really kind of know what was going on, you still seem to have a childlike hope.
Oh, yeah. So it was 3 years later, and I learned later she'd been in lockdown psychiatric ward, electroshock therapy. And I know of at least 8 times she was in lockdown psychiatric wards with electroshock therapy. I never saw a formal diagnosis of her, but, as I came to understand, manic depressant and other psychological issues that she had, I could pretty much make a list of what they were. But I was on the playground at the orphanage, and somebody yelled, Robbie, your mother's here. And I'm so excited because you see, kids like us, we always want to go home. We always want to go home, even though home is a mythology. And it's not the place we imagine it is, but we just want to go home. So I go running up to the visitor's room. And as I run in, my wonderful dorm mother named Nola, my mother's yelling and screaming at her. I'm thinking, why are you screaming at Nola? She's a good person. And I run up and I hug my mother's leg, and she smells bad because alcoholics and drug users smell bad. And finally, my mother, I said, Mother, quit yelling at Nola. Let's take the train back to Chicago. Let's go home. And she looks down at me. She says, I got to go. She didn't hug me. She didn't kiss me. She didn't tell me she loved me. She says, I got to go. And she turned around and walked out of the door. And I was so stunned, I didn't know what to say. And Nola bent down and hugged me. And she said, Robbie, this is not your fault. This is not your fault, Robbie. And I literally could not talk for 3 weeks. And Nola and the caseworkers tried to get me to talk, and I couldn't. And finally, Nola came to me in the playground. She said, Robbie, just say something, please. Just say something. And all I could say was, my heart hurts. And that was all I could say.
I'm so glad that you had Nola. I mean, that she sounds so much better, um, in a place where things were just so hard, that there was that little bit of love, that little bit of hope. W when did you go from, I mean, at such a young age to have the childlike kind of grace and forgiveness that we have for our parents to, "No, this isn't okay," and trying to understand?
It was a variety of steps. The orphanage had on any given day 60 kids. We were broken up in little groups, or 4 groups: little boys, little girls, big boys, big girls. Obviously, at my young age, I was in little boys. Um, I lost hope when I was 7 years old in second grade. That's called emotional flatlining, when you just don't care anymore. And I locked my heart down. I said, the big boys can beat me till I cry out in physical pain, but no one's going to hurt me emotionally again. 7 years old in second grade. Um, when I got to big boys, at 6 years old or 10 years old in sixth grade, uh, I got beat up every day of my life until ninth grade. But these kids are really clever when you've been in the system long enough. They know how to hit you without drawing blood or creating bruises. So they usually hit you in your hair, your back, whatever. If they got caught beating up on you enough, they'd get kicked out of the home to juvie hall or someplace worse. But by ninth grade, I stopped fighting to win. I started fighting to inflict maximum pain. Winning was optional. And even the big boys left me alone. Um, One of the things that about that time that I finally decided was, in looking at the big boys, was almost all of them ended up dead or in prison by the time they were 20. And I just made a vow I wasn't going to do that. And so I started working all sorts of jobs, detasseling corn, baling hay, mowing yards, shoveling snow, working in a lumber yard. And I thought money would save me instead of the track of dead or in prison. And so by 1970, at 16 years old, I had saved $3,000. Now, putting that in inflation adjusted numbers, you could have bought a brand new Ford Mustang with that. But I couldn't let anybody know that. I mean, my caseworker knew it, but I couldn't let the kids know that because then they'd hit me up for the money or beat me up for the money. One of the But I thought, $3,000 when you walked out the door, then it was a one-way bus ticket to wherever you wanted to go. Good luck, kid. And you were literally homeless. And I thought, okay, I got enough money to survive for a while. And so I was intentional that I was not going to end up dead or in prison. I didn't know where I was going to end up, but that was not going to be my life story.
Something you said there where it kind of clicked. You had lost hope, and then, you went kind of from victim to um, at least a retaliator with, enough to keep them at bay. But you also saw something in them that you didn't want for
Right.
yourself. And this is the biggest question, I think, probably in groups sitting around talking when they read this book, is the question of nature versus nurture. Because in this situation, we have you in this exact situation that everyone else you're with is in. But you made the choice that, no, I don't want what they have, and I don't want to be like them. And I'm going to actually have a plan here and goals and set out to make those goals happen. How did you become successful? Not just thinking it, but making it real.
Um, One of the ways is that I decided that I did not want to work for somebody with a paycheck because working for somebody who gave me a paycheck gave them the authority to tell me what I was worth. And I just didn't want that. So I've literally been straight commission since 1978. Now, there were several months where we couldn't pay the bills. Okay.
Mhm.
So I'm not saying that's an easy route to go. It's a very hard route to go. But I wanted to be paid by the sales calls that I made, my success in the sales calls. And again, it wasn't easy. I just didn't want somebody to tell me what I was worth. I wanted to let the marketplace tell me what I was worth. And it was hard. It was very hard uh, initially. But eventually, after a lot of work, um, I started becoming successful, and it was process, lots of failure, lots of no's, not lots of rejection. But at this stage of my life, I already knew what rejection was like, so I could handle all the no's and just okay, and just kept persevering and finding what I was good at, what I wasn't good at. Um, some salesmen are good at selling a product. I use the analogy when I speak to sales group. I've got a blue ink pen. You want it? No. Okay. I got a blue ink pen. You want it? And you just keep knocking on doors. Or they're really good at solution sales. And the same analogy would be I sell writing, uh, uh, writing instruments. If I can find the correct writing instrument for you at a price you're willing to pay, is there any reason we can't do business? So there's product sales and there's solution sales. And I found I was really good at solution sales. Um, and that there are people out there who want people who will take the time to solve their problems. And I found I was really good at that. So I did really good being a solution salesman.
Now, we skipped over some major parts of being an adolescent living in such a hard place and having been abandoned, and then also having parents who had substance abuse problems and other issues in their lives that definitely affect their children even when they're not
Oh, yeah.
around. So you not only came out of a situation that was very difficult, but you also stayed away from going down the path that your parents were in.
The number one way I overcame it was something I did not want to do. And that was in my junior year in college, God called me to forgive. And I said, I can't. I, I, I won't. I mean, seriously, I mean, it may sound to Christian listeners a bit blasphemous, but there were three adults in my life who I knew I needed to forgive. My father's mother, who actually was dead, my father, who was still alive but brain dead, and my mother, who was lost somewhere in the streets of Chicago. I really don't know how my mother survived. I don't know if she prostituted herself or not. I never asked. Um, but God made it clear I had to forgive them to get past those issues. And so I started with my grandmother Mitchell first, and knowing she'd be the easiest. Forgiving my father was difficult. Forgiving my mother was incredibly difficult. I literally got ulcers working through that. And I share those chapters in the book. And the forgiveness chapters, I'm often told by people who meet me but have read my book, caught them completely by surprise. That they never expected that I would forgive anybody or should have forgiven anybody. But God made it totally clear I had to forgive them. And what I learned in the process of forgiving, and I feel I also, in writing those three chapters, help the reader become equipped, is that yes, I forgave someone who is dead, which is a completely foreign concept. Somebody who's brain dead. I saw my mother twice. I made a point to try and find her um, once a year. Um, I don't know if it's out of guilt, but people like my mother, homeless people like my mother, they tend to hang out in a certain area of town. So I knew at least what part of Chicago she probably was in. And I'd buy her a meal um, and listen to her rant and rave because in her mind, she was the best mother in the history of all mothers. I mean, that's how out of her mind she was. But what I learned about genuinely, honestly forgiving the three of them was forgiving did not free them. My dead grandmother obviously did not know she was forgiven. My father in a mental hospital did not know he was forgiven. And there was no point telling my mother she was forgiven because she just would have exploded. Forgiving didn't free them. Forgiving freed me. It freed me of the anger and the rage, and it freed me to keep moving on to become the man God imagined I could be, not the man my childhood said I was doomed to be.
So you, in a sense, got your hope back
Yes.
when you found your faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what do you say to people who don't have that faith and are missing that kind of hope?
I think the first thing that I would say to them is you have to have a vision for who you want to be. It's got to be a good vision. But in that vision for who you want to be, there also needs to be something very important. You have to have a vision of who you don't want to be. And what about you do you need to find a way to get rid of? And that's very important. Who don't you want to be? And how are you going to release that? Um, and to me, those are both very important. And sometimes you need to work on who don't you want to be to release it first, to move on to who you do want to be. And I certainly found that as an angry, bitter punk, 17-year-old punk um, in the Covenant Children's Home when I genuinely asked Jesus Christ to change me. I didn't hear angels sing. I didn't roll on the floor in some kind of spiritual ecstasy. But in a moment, I knew that the Holy God of the universe had reached out of heaven and touched the heart of an angry, bitter 17-year-old punk and began to change my life. And it was process. I mean, I was a mess. Some days I went one step forward, two steps back. I was still drinking and doing marijuana. I didn't do anything heavier than marijuana because I got kicked out of there to, you know, juvie hall or someplace worse. And I actually was in um, juvenile prison for one night when I was 8 years old. And that's in the book. I definitely didn't want to go there. Um, but it was process and it took a long time. It took me probably till my sophomore year in college before I stopped doing marijuana. Figured this might not be what God wants me to do.
Right. Well, that's a great answer and great advice, and clearly an amazing success story. But now, as we look into your life, you have your family, your children, your grandchildren. How did it affect you when you became a parent? And now knowing I need to protect these children in ways I was never taught, and in all the ways that I know I wanted to be protected.
So my wife would definitely tell you I was a hands-on razzle-dazzle kind of guy dad. I mean, I would get up early in the morning, usually 4 o'clock, map out my list of sales calls, work really, really hard to be home by 5 o'clock. So I worked a lot of hours, but it was when my kids were asleep, or in school. And she would tell you what I'm about to tell you too, that when I came home, there'd easily be 10 to 20 neighborhood kids wanting to know when Mr. Mitchell could come out and play because their dads didn't interact with them. I mean, they didn't. They'd come home and they'd do whatever they wanted to do. And so we had a particularly special game, and we had two bases and a home base and a rubber kind of kickball, and I always did the pitching. And they scored if one of them could get all the way to home base. I scored if I tagged them out. So, and if they used bad language, bad attitude, then I kicked them out for a week. And they'd still stand on the street to watch it. They didn't want to leave because, again, most of the dads did not interact with these kids, and they would literally they'd be knocking on the door before I got on my suit, saying, "When can Mr. Mitchell come out and play?" Because I was a safe adult male, and even when I kicked them out. But what I was doing was giving them boundaries, and kids need those boundaries, even if they fight against them. They just can't be so tight that you choke them. And if they kids don't really want to know how kids don't care about how much you know until they know how much you care. And when they know how much you care, then they'll start listening to you.
So when it comes to disciplining your own kids, maybe in the times where you think they're being ungrateful or they just really have no idea what they have concerning what you didn't have, do you separate yourself from that? I mean, how do you keep yourself always in control of those emotions?
So when they were younger, normally it was time out sitting in a chair. And then I'd come back and say, okay, what'd you do wrong? And they had to verbalize what it was. Then I asked, are you sorry? And almost all the time they said yes. And so I'd hug them, kiss them, and say, and tell them, I forgive you. Now and then, especially my son, no, I'm not sorry. Okay, stay in the chair. And I'd come back to him an hour or two later. Are you sorry? No. Okay. But eventually he'd say yes. Um, Now and then, especially if he sassed off to his mother, I would spank his bottom and put him in there. But there's only one spank ever, only one spank, because child abuse is often a repeated cycle. And my attitude was if I spanked him more than once, I was crossing into child abuse. Um, I still remember coming home one day and we had a small house, 1,248 square feet. And I'm walking down, I turn the corner to walk down the hall and I see Luke talking to mom and she's clearly trying not to laugh. And the night before coming home from church, he sassed off to his mom and pulled the car over, pulled him out of his little car seat. And he had Pampers on, diapers on. And I gave him one hard smack. He couldn't even felt it, but it was, that's not going to be tolerated. So I'm walking down the hall. All of a sudden, he sees me and screams and runs out of the bedroom. That's when my wife starts laughing out loud. I'm like, "What was that all about?" He said, "Mama, when I need to get spanked, would you do it instead?" And I said, "Why?" "Well, when Daddy spanked me last night, it still hurts, but when you spank me, it never hurts." Um, but I didn't spank often, and I, you know, usually timeouts worked. And when both of them had to go in timeout because their bedrooms right next to each other, I mean, there was just a wall between them. They would quickly get on the floor and start whispering and trying to figure out how they can negotiate getting out of timeout.
Well, how old were they when you wrote the book and then when they started to express interest and find out more about you?
So the book came out when my son was in high school, but along the way, we would tell them that I remember my daughter once saying, "I wish I knew your parents. They must have been wonderful." I'm like, "No, no, no, no. Don't have that thought." And so I would tell them little things along the way as we thought they could comprehend it without scaring them. And then we took a trip up to the orphanage. I think about the time they were maybe 9 and 12. And I remember playing with the kids on the big playground equipment, 'cause we had fabulous playground equipment, and seeing my wife talking to the then director, who'd also been a caseworker when I was there. And at that very moment, I saw my wife's face just do one of these, from the pleasant Southern belle to really deep sadness. I just happened to catch that look at the moment it changed. And Nola had retired. My dorm mother married a widow farmer. And so we were staying at the farmhouse with them, got the kids in bed. My wife and I went to bed, and I told her about that moment. I said, "What happened in that moment?" And she asked Dave, the caseworker, she's director, she said, "What are your hope for your kids?" He said, "Finish high school, don't go to prison, hold a job." She said, "What about marriage and children?" He said, "That's not realistic. Finish high school, stay out of prison, hold a job." They said, "Getting married and have children is not realistic with these kids." And my wife said, and I took no offense, she said, "Rob, I always thought you made some of this stuff up." Feel the love, really. But it didn't offend me. And she said, "Now I realize you didn't make it up. In fact, you probably understated it." I said, "Oh, yes, Susan, I understated it."
So speaking of breaking the generational chains that you were under, and now what you've done for your family, I really want to hear more about what you've done for others. You do talk about it in the book, but like you said, I think sometimes you understate really how powerful it is and what you've done with your life, not for yourself, but for so many others.
So I think the two things I would mention pre-COVID, um, and COVID for some reason just shut down all speaking engagements. Um, and I've accepted it. I miss it, but I accepted it. I traveled 12 to 18 weeks a year, speaking all over the world, all over America to at-risk kids or groups that work with at-risk kids. Um, and oftentimes it was a fundraiser. So many times it was 3,000 people. In Germany, it was 3,000 people. Um, but when I went, in fact, here in Grand Rapids, the group that invited me up, I said, "I'd like you to jam me up with at-risk kids in smaller environments." And the woman who headed up took me to my word. So I spoke 6 times in 5.5 days here in Grand Rapids and the juvenile prison outside of Detroit. And I always wear these suits because I want to fracture the minds of the kids. How could somebody who walked the walk, because they realize quickly I've walked the walk, I can talk the talk. How can a kid who understands us, who was 14 years in orphanage, come out looking like this? I looked like this on purpose to fracture um, their perception and to start getting a vision that, well, if this guy could do it, if he could come out of my situation, details are different, then maybe there's still hope for me. And that's what I want to do. And that's why I always have the adults, even the prison guards, stand outside of line of vision because I want to see those light bulbs going off. It juices me tremendously. I'm exhausted, but it juices me. The other thing that I do is I typically give 20 to 30% of my pre-tax income to orphan care groups and those who work with terribly at-risk kids. Um, and again, it's pre-tax income. And I had breakfast with a older Christian gentleman. He's probably 20, 30 years older than me. And he was a serial entrepreneur. Uh, he was kind of a horse trader and type guy. And he would only stop for breakfast. So I knew that. And I said, I just made $100,000 last year. I said, "I'm embarrassed. I feel guilty." what's a kid from an orphanage doing making $100,000? And this was, I don't know, 20 some years ago, 30 years ago. I'll never forget what he said. He said, Rob, God needs money men. He needs men who know how to make money. And he wasn't putting down women, but that was his style. That was his generation.
Mhm.
He said, God needs men who can make money and give it away freely. And if you keep giving away freely, you'll make more money and keep giving away freely. And I was kind of to myself, I can do that. I don't know how much money I can make. I certainly made more money than I ever dreamed, even just annually, not to mention my portfolio. And, I don't say that with any kind of bragging, but um, I do it with joy. And I fund organizations that I read their Form 990s, which are basically their tax returns, and I look at how much they spend on fundraising. And if it's too much of the budget, then I'm not going to give them money. I want to make sure they're being efficient with it and they're staying true to efficiencies. And again, God needs money men, and He's decided to let me be one of them. And I do it with joy.
And now, as we go into the future, your children are also on this path
Hmm.
and your grandchildren as well. So long after we are gone, this kind of work will still be going on because of you.
Right, because we've created it's called a donor advised fund, but it's like a foundation, and there will be a lot of money there. Um, and my children have the authority to give it away, at, in agreement to primarily to foster care support, at-risk kids support, and orphan care support. So at least half my estate's going there, and my kids know that.
That's amazing. So what other things are important to you now and that you've I know you like hiking. There's some other things in your life that you enjoy. Let's talk a little bit about who you are outside of Money Man and a child of unfortunate circumstances. Who are you now at home with your family and your grandkids?
So one of the ministries that I have been involved in for a number of years is my wife and I have financially and other ways started two French African churches in town. And in the book, there's a chapter where I spent a year deep in the jungles of the Congo. And I've studied 7 languages and picked up one of their languages very quickly. And so in America, when I meet someone from the Congo and I start speaking Lingala to them, they just start laughing. I mean, they're holding their sides laughing because they've never met a white man, or they call the word for a white person is Mundeli. And it just means a white person. They've never met a Mundeli who speaks their language. Um, and So it's fun to be there and worship with them. My wife's actually leading a 3-day women's conference at one of the churches coming up soon. So 3 days? What? Why didn't you just do half a day? I mean, but anyway, she doesn't speak Lingala. They all think, well, and they call me Tata, but Tata really means father, but it also is a sign of deep respect for a man, even if he's not in a biological relationship. So they all call me Tata Robert. They can't say Rob, so Tata Robert. And there's a couple of uh, Congolese dishes that I absolutely love. My wife can't; she won't eat them. She can't even stand the smell of them. But so that's something I love being part of. And but I think I would honestly say it's my children and my grandchildren, because I don't get to see them as often as my wife does. And it just gives me great joy to watch them grow up and watch my children parent them. I mean, I'm happy to sit back and kind of be, instead of being Mr. Important, be almost invisible or help wash the dishes. And I don't mind changing diapers; doesn't bother me a bit. And if it's a real blowout, and they're sitting there with just a diaper and a little plastic something over it, sometimes just for the fun of it, I'll pick them up, pull it off, put them in the sink, and hose them down. You know, and they laugh because they think it's fun. Do it again, Poppy. But that's what I do with my kids. So it's the quickest way to clean them off.
Now, how about any other surprising relationships that you have maybe from your past or that we would be surprised to find out about?
The only kid I kept up with is a guy, I'll pass on his name, um, and he and I talk about every other month. He never married, and the reason why is that he was so abused, um, especially by the women in his life, sister, bio mother, grandmother, that and he said this to me repeatedly, he just could not get to where he would forgive them or could forgive them, depending which word he wants to use. And I hurt for him, but he did finish college, but he I just wish he could have come to the point of forgiveness. But at the same time, I've also told him that I respect that he did not repeat the cycle and have children and repeat the cycle. So he's one. And then Nola, my dorm mother, moved to Missouri. It took quite a while to find her. Um, Not that she was trying to hide from me, it's just nobody knew where she was. And so I went out and visited her on a business trip to St. Louis, and man, that was the middle of nowhere. And they called me to speak or preach her funeral, which was really sweet. And a couple months later, going through her stuff, they found three pages of the names of all the boys she took care of. She actually, I hadn't shared this, on little boys, she took care of between 10 and 15 little boys, ages 3 to 10, 24 hours a day, 5.5 days a week, by herself. It's mind boggling. And they found a list of all the boys by year, and she prayed for each and every one of them every day, even though she didn't know where but a couple of them were. And they asked me if I wanted. I said absolutely. And I have 170 people on my prayer list, anyways. I don't tell people, "Oh, I'm gonna pray for you." Heart wash. I am gonna pray for you. It's in my computer, and I also pray for each of those boys that Noah prayed for every day, even though I only know where three of them are, and couple I know are dead. Some under terrible circumstances. Drug deals gone bad.
Wow. She sounds like an amazing woman.
She was. Proverbs 21:31 says, "The horse is prepared for the day of the battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord." Noah was a good horse, great horse, and she didn't want any publicity at all.
So what's next for Rob?
So I'm working towards retiring. Um, about 3 years selling my practice. I know who I want to sell it to. We're we've had it valued, and or I've had it valued rather. The next step is her being comfortable spending that kind of money. She's been with me 15 years, brilliant woman, um, younger than me by almost 20 years. Um, and my business is kind of like the young pastor who started a church and grew into a very big church. And what that pastor needs to do is leave town. So people in the church are not coming back to him, "Meh, meh, 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 meh," about the new pastor. Because I don't have customers, I have clients. And I have many clients that are actually 4 generations. The deceased parents are my clients, the retired kids are my clients, their adult kids are my clients, and their children with college education plans are my clients. And I have many, many 3 generation clients that are still active. So it's not about customers, it's clients. And I need to leave town just so they now work with my team. And I have very low client loss ratio, 1% basically. And so I'll leave town. We have an apartment in a city called Raleigh, which is about 90 miles from our house. But it's in town with my son and daughter-in-law and their 2 little kids, and only an hour from my daughter and her 5 kids. So my wife's down there 3 to 5 nights a week helping one or both of them. And I've joined my son's church, and so we will sell our house um, in Greensboro area and build or buy a house in Raleigh. So that'll be part of the first step. And the other step is so many executives plan financially to retire, but they don't plan emotionally to retire. And they wake up and they're miserable because they never planned to emotionally to retire. And quite frankly, they didn't plan to live with their wife 24/7. And I say that with humor.
Vice versa.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a real problem.
Mhm.
And I've seen that in my own clients. So I've actually started a couple weeks ago with after much research, I consider a really good male Christian counselor, and I'm preparing myself to be retired um, because I don't want to walk out the door and say I'm miserable. I'm preparing to be retired and preparing to live with my wife 24/7. She doesn't think it's going to be a problem, but I'm just preparing.
Well, it'll be great for the grandkids. I'm sure
Yeah,
they will be very excited to have you around more often. Can we look forward to any more writing from you?
I don't know. I don't know if there's a place for a sequel to Castaway Kid. I certainly have some other books I have in mind. Certainly a certain amount of travel. I've been 22 nations. I don't know if I want to take up another language and refine it. I was very good French and German in particular, but French I could use with my French African friends. I don't know yet. Uh,
Would you consider something that could speak to that 3-year-old boy where he was at in that moment that could maybe help him in his time? A children's book, maybe?
um, yeah, I've thought of that. I, I I don't know. I've got a list of things. So I've made a list of things and sort of a bucket list kind of thing, but they're not hard fast.
Mhm.
They're just items that I may want to think about doing. But one of the things I don't want to do is jump into something and run around like a chicken with his head cut off.
Mhm.
Um, I want to be very thoughtful and purposeful in what I do early in retirement. And part of it's just going to be to rest.
Mhm.
I mean, I've run pretty hard for 38 years and I want to rest.
Well, I certainly enjoyed the book, and so many people have all over the world. And I think we all know that you wouldn't, be able to jump in and run around. I think everything you do is well thought out and is going to be successful, and certainly would love to see more.
Thank you. And I'll go as God leads. And if he wants a second, and what happened next, Robbie,
Mhm.
kind of book, I'll consider it. But right now he's not leading me that way. So, and I'm pretty certain if he